always feel like a mezzo-soprano after Pat gets done introducing me with that bellowing voice of his. Billy was telling me he tried to get another MC, but John Moore was too tall for that suit. And he tried to get another sport historian, but Burton Russell was too small for this one. I'm not sure that's true. I've been asked to do a brief overview of Nova Scotian sport for the last 125 years. That's like asking Tommy Sweet to count the number of women kissed on the cheek over the years. But I'll do my best to keep it brief. Please work remote control. Oh, we're in a good start. Sorry, is there any technician here? Get our remote control going. All right. The man Pat was talking about is George Dixon. I arrived in Nova Scotia, and I knew all about George Dixon. I was on Gottingen Street one day, my kids in a daycare center, and I stopped a little black kid. I said, "Hey, who's George Dixon?" I've told this story before. Some of you know it well. And he said, "George Dixon ain't a who, it's a what." He said, "It's the playground up the street." And I said, "Yeah, but George Dixon is a man. Do you know who George Dixon is?" No, he didn't. And I thought to myself, well, you know how? He said, a little black kid on Gottingen Street didn't know who George Dixon was. He was born on Gottingen Street in 1870. Is still listed as the world's best bantamweight boxer in history. Was three-time world champion. I thought, well, there was some work to be done as a sport historian. I then got a push when my kids were on their way up to Ontario one time, and they're volleyball players, and they said they were going to lose because they were going up to Ontario. And I thought, what the hell are you talking about? You know, at the time, Karen Mason was captain of the volleyball team, Canada's volleyball team. Karen Fraser was on the Olympic team. Rich Bacon was captain of the men's team, and the Dow team had just won the CIAU championships in volleyball. And my kids thought they were going to lose when they went to Ontario. Well, we couldn't afford that. So I went out and started to tell people about things that most of them already knew, but at least I pulled it together from the knowledge that a lot of you people out there had. And you all know I've been picking your brains for the last 23 years and trying to come up with a sport history. George Dixon is not alone in the kind of success he had. Sam Langford, the Boston Tar Baby, is listed as the 7th best heavyweight in history, despite the fact that he never even fought for the heavyweight championship, down from Weymouth Falls, down around Yarmouth. He wasn't given a fight because the champion at the time, a black guy by the name of Jack Johnson, refused to fight the black boxers because they were better. I mean, that's why he didn't, but it was recognized that 5'6", at his best fighting weight, 170 pounds, he blew himself up to 200 because that's where the money was. And he was highly successful in his era before 1920. He won the Mexican heavyweight championship while he was legally blind. So we've got stories that our kids have to know about. We really want Can I train somebody to push buttons back there if I signal them? There's a button on the machine that says forward. If you'll hit that every time I go like this, we'll have a slide change and we'll be able to get through the night. Thanks. Rowing was a biggie. Professional rowers came out of the job. Herring Cove's George Brown used to get the job to pilot the ships in because he was the fastest guy in his boat out to the ships when they came on the horizon. So they then had professional rowing races. 30,000 people used to go out in Nova Scotia to watch the Harbor Championship. Unbelievable. Another complaint I have about the teaching of Canadian history in general, but Canadian sport history as well, is that we always try and make everybody out to be the greatest people in the world. Some of our finest athletes are not particularly great people, and they may make mistakes even though they are nice people. George Dixon died of a venereal disease. And because we don't teach that to our kids and things like that, they tend to think that the only interesting history goes from south of the border, and that's unfortunately not the case. So we want, in my opinion, to teach them everything, to teach them that, you know, we've had some great athletes, and some of you great athletes out there don't always behave yourselves, and some of the times when you don't is some of the more interesting times in your life and makes Canadian sport history a lot more interesting. That's Henry Pelham in the front. Old Henry was the Micmac stroke in 1932. They won the Canadian Henley, went to the Olympics in 1932. Old Henry was a character the likes of which you'll never know. He's since passed on, of course. Old Henry, I was out to his house one time, and the dog used to always jump up and dirty my trousers. I used to wear my old drawers when I'd go out there to visit him. One time I went out, no dog. I said, Henry, where's the dog? I shot him. I said, what do you mean you shot him? Did it have rabies or something? No, it was growling, so I shot him, he said. He said, I turned to the wife, and I said, there was 2 things growling, now there's only one. You want there to be none, you keep growling, Alice, he said. I mean, that's what Henry Pelham was like. He was a magnificent athlete, but he was a character, bar none. That's a more modern hero, Bob Mills, and indicates some other side of our sport history, and that is we're always fighting those of the power up in Upper Canada. They don't hate us, they just ignore us. Bob Mills, made his way onto the 4-oar team for the Olympics. He didn't get along with his boat mates because they wanted their buddy back in the boat, the guy they'd always trained with. They made things so miserable for him, he quit. He trained, got into singles, made it to the Olympics, got a bronze medal in the Olympics. The guy that he had beat him out the following year. He got back in the boat, and they went and won the world championship. Bob Mills from Dartmouth. So, our modern history is as exciting as our other history. Can you change that? Am I changing these, or are you changing these? Thanks. The Blue Nose, you don't have to know about the Blue Nose. 1921, we got beat in a race. They got sick of it, so they built the Blue Nose and went and beat the Gloucester Fishermen for years. Give me another slide, please. Good old Phil Scott, Barrington Passage. You go down there, big billboard, welcome to the home, a 9-time world champion log roller. He went down as a 20-year-old kid. He joined all these guys that never heard of him. He stayed on the log for 3 hours and 20 minutes, sort of laughing at them, weighed about $1.05. The great big monster of a guy is controlling everything, and all he did was keep running back and forth on the log, and finally the guy fell in the water. He couldn't believe it. He did it 9 different times from Barrington Passage. Marvelous story. Nancy Garapic, 1975, breaks a world record. Word comes into the local newspaper, Joel Jacobson. Nobody believes it. They wouldn't put it in the paper until I read it in the Toronto Star. I went looking, I said, what kind of world record did she break? She was a 14-year-old kid from Cornwallis Junior High School. Was it the fastest little blonde kid or something like that? She had swum faster than any other woman in the world. And to me, that really was important because those newspaper reporters, no offense, couldn't believe that some kids who practiced in Nova Scotia waters could produce that kind of a performance. Now, we cannot expect that kind of performance every time we put an athlete on the field or on a court or in the pool. But when it happens, we should feel good enough about ourselves to at least believe it. When it comes across on the CP, which they usually take to be better than the Bible, in this instance, it took some convincing for them. Curling, first time we ever had the Brier, 1927, Halifax Curling Club won it. First time we ever hosted it, the Glooscap Club from 1951 in Kentville won it. Can we give me another slide, please? We get Penny LaRock in female curling, the first to win a national championship. Colleen Jones has done it a couple occasions. Berta Kempton's won the senior. Curling is marvelous. You go to the curling club down here in Halifax, the sheets are numbered 1824 because that's how old that club is. 1824 it started, before they even had indoor rinks. Rob McCall, Marie McNeil, Canadian champions. He went on, of course, to change partners. Tracy Wilson became his partner. He got a bronze medal in the Olympics. He's since died of AIDS. Should the kids know about this? Oh, of course they should. Hell, he was a magnificent athlete. Why are we fussing over Magic Johnson? They all know about Magic Johnson. How many of them know about Rob McCall? And why shouldn't they? Same lessons to be learned. Basketball. Last year we had the 100th anniversary of basketball, talking about the 125 years of sport in Nova Scotia and in Canada. In this picture, which is the first team to play against another team, there were 18 guys in his class, a guy named James Naismith, a Canadian who invented it. He's from Almont, Ontario. Next spring, they had a team that went out. On this team, there were 5 guys from Canada. 3 of them are from Nova Scotia. We had on stage last year a relative of one of these guys, John Thompson. It was a marvelous time. Give me another slide, please. I can't see beyond. Basketball for women got started right away. It's tough to study, really tough to study women's sport because most of the source material is newspapers, and in the old days they just didn't put women's sport in the newspapers. So we don't have anything left but oral history. So that's the reason a lot of the early wonderful athletes who were women are ignored, with the exception of a couple, one of whom is here tonight. Karen Mason, the woman I was speaking about earlier in volleyball. Field hockey, 1973 Canadian champions. You know, we have wonderful women's sport. The Spring Hill Fence Busters, back when baseball was big, during the old H&D League, 10 years after World War II especially. 24 guys went into the majors out of that league. And our own players were every good or better. Buddy Conde and Skip Ferguson, Jack Gray, Johnny Clark, Hum Joseph. These guys were every bit as good as these imports. Absolutely every bit as good. Baseball was big. Baseball was real important. The Stellarton Monarchs, 1937, went down to Boston. They won the Eastern North American Championship. I mean, there was nothing else. They went down there and saw their first whip pitch. They had never seen one before. Hell, we'll be talking later about Fred Cuvelier with his pitching, and he didn't use the whip pitch up in the 40s and 50s, because in Nova Scotia, of course, we were a little bit behind in that regard. Brookfield Elks, and that little town up there in Brookfield, has the most marvelous athletic complex and programs for their youth of any small town in the province. Every small town should learn from the way they went about things. This team went on to not only win the Canadian Championship in A softball, but they went on to the World Series, came third in the World Series down in California. Billy O'Donnell, the world's richest driver, comes from Nova Scotia. I mean, he won so much money, up in the millions of dollars. We listed him last year. It just go on and on and on. You know, our kids should know about it. Johnny Miles, Sidney Mines, he went down in 1926 to the Boston Marathon. They described him as an apple-cheeked laddie with eyes as blue as a tobacco can. The Edgeworth tobacco can, you might recall it, those of you who are a little older. Bright, bright blue eyes, and they thought how cute he was. He went out the night before to try and figure out where the course was with his father, and they stopped the cop and said, "Where's it go from here?" Cop said, "Oh, I'll just follow the rest of the runners." And his father said, no, my kid's going to be in front. And the cop laughed like hell and said, "Well, you turn left up there at the street there and then go down, whatever." Next day, he was in the shower 2.5 minutes before the 6-time Boston Marathon victor, Clarence DeMar. He was in the shower more than 4 minutes before Eric Stenbruce, the reigning Olympic champion, 20-year-old kid. He went back in 1929. By then, he came from Hamilton because he got recruited, as did a lot of our good athletes in that day and age. This woman's name is Gertrude Finney. In the old days, her name since then is Gertrude Finney Young. She had 5 kids under that name, and now she's Gertrude Finney Young Beatty because she's married to Tom Beatty, and he's here tonight, and he'll beat me up if I don't call her by her correct name. She went to the track and field championships in 1927, the Olympic trials, won the 200, missed it in the 100 by a hair's breadth to a woman who went on to get a gold medal in Amsterdam Olympics. She was picked for the Olympic team, of course. She was Canadian champion in the 200. The Canadian team won more medals than any other team at the Olympics in 1928, the first year that women were ever permitted to compete in track and field. Her father said, "Don't go," because the Pope at the time was saying, and the physicians were saying, and the physical educators were saying, "You'll do irreparable harm to those mysterious inner workings if you go and compete as an athlete in track and field." So she stayed home. She would have come back not only with medals, but with gold medals. Gertrude Finney is here tonight. Out there somewhere, if we could ask her to stand. Gertrude? You think there's not a lesson for kids in that? Guy on the left, Lee Miller, he's tying right here a guy named Eddie Tolliver, Olympic champion. He ran in Pictou, ran in 9 3/5 seconds. Lee Miller usually comes to these affairs. I don't think he's here tonight, at least I haven't been told that he is. Lee Miller tied the world record in Pictou. The upper Canadian officials said no, there was a trailing wind. We can't recognize it. So the other competitors said, "Oh no, the only wind we had was very slight, it was in our faces." So they said, "Well, the track runs downhill." They came back in the next spring with the surveyors, and they found out the finish was 7.5 inches higher in altitude than was the start, so therefore they recognized the record. By then, he'd done it on 3 other occasions. Lee Miller walks around Dowplex and exercise. Nobody there knows who he is except me. That's a mistake. You know, I ask my kids every year, "Who's Babe Ruth?" and they laugh at me. But if I ask them, "Who's Lee Miller? Who's Gertrude Finney? Who's Eileen Marr? Who's Johnny Miles?" they sometimes don't know. They're starting to learn a little more. Eileen Marr, running school marm, athlete of the year 1935. Not only the female athlete of the year, but the Norton H. Crow winner, which is athlete of the year barring sex. After that time, it was restricted to men only. But she won athlete of the year. She is not included in a book put out by the Canadian government called the 50 Greatest Canadian Female Athletes. I think there's a lesson to be learned there. This woman's here tonight. Her name is Turner. She's got another list of names too. In the old days when names always changed, at least all women took on new names when they got married. Marjorie Turner Bailey Brown. Her son Tony's here. Tony Bailey is about 6'10", 350 pounds, so I'm going to try and get this story straight if I can. 1964, Marjorie Turner went to the Acadia Relays as the single entrant from her high school, Lockport High School. She went and won every event, won the high school championship by herself. She was on the Olympic team, got hurt. She was on the Olympic team again in 1968, Mexico Olympics, got hurt. She was on again in 72, she got hurt. She then became a mother. She moved to Jamaica with her husband, had Tony, her child. She then went on welfare, came back, started to train for the 76 Olympics. She was on welfare, living on $285 a month. First, she tried to carry 2 jobs and train, realized she couldn't do it. Lived on that $285 a month until she made it in the Olympics. She ran in 8 separate events. She didn't win any medals, but she deserves an unbelievable amount of credit. And there are lessons to be learned from our history, from our heritage. Marjorie Turner. Where's Marjorie? Vida Large, you want heroes for your kids? Vida Large, the woman on the left here. Vida Large won 45 times badminton and tennis championships at the Nova-Scotia and the maritime level. The last 3 she won after having her 3rd operation for cancer. You want stories for kids? Why do we always fall back on the damn stories we hear about those people south of the border? Our heritage is as rich as anywhere in the world. We just sort of have to spread it around and get teachers particularly and coaches knowing the stories. Hockey, you heard, hockey started here in Nova Scotia. Don't ever believe that it started anywhere else. In 1941, a Canadian committee, Upper Canadian Committee, was struck to see where the official home of Canadian hockey was. So they looked at Kingston, which was one claimant, at the time Halifax, which was another claimant, and at the time Montreal, which was the third. They said Kingston was the home. Kingston had hockey, yes, they did have a kind of hockey. 1855, they were able to trace it, 100 men on a side. We had hockey like that on Long Pond up in Windsor. We had hockey like that traced back to 1810. Half a century before then. So they said, okay, well, you're right. Bill Fitzel, up at the Hockey Hall of Fame in Kingston, says, no, we are not the originators, but he goes along with the Montreal claim because he said that's the first time they played with a set of rules and had a defined number of players. The 1875 game, the rules they played by, and everybody agrees to this, by the way, were called the Halifax rules. They were called the Halifax rules because they were written by James Aylwin Creighton, who went to Halifax Grammar School, then Dalhousie, before he went up to McGill. And he taught them the game he was playing. And we have another set of rules that predates them. Tommy Sweet found them in the paper that talk about a game with a different name. But at that time, hockey was called all sorts of things. Hockey began in Nova Scotia. Don't let anybody tell you different. Women's hockey was prevalent. It's just now getting popular again. Again, same problems. We got a lot of pictures of them because they thought women were pretty, but no stories.